Hello, my name is Daniel Fink, and during the next 2 hours I will be demonstrating a new way for you to achieve perfectly fitting slacks. I know many of you have tried several different methods prior to this one, but you still haven't been obtaining the results that you've been expecting. Now this problem doesn't arise from your sewing technique, but mainly from the patterns that you were using in the first place. I say this for two reasons. If you consider these facts, you'll understand my reasoning. All manufactured patterns are made to standard sizes, and all the other sizes are either increased or decreased equally all the way around according to your bust or hip size. My other emphasis is placed on the fact that every pattern company has their own means of standards for making their patterns. This is evident when you find that no two commercial patterns ever run the same. Now the method I'm going to be introducing you to doesn't grade patterns in the conventional means, but instead this method will allow you to grade a pattern to your own body measurements and body proportions. Now the method I'm referring to originated in West Germany a little over 50 years ago. Back in the early 1930s, the West Germans incorporated Da Vinci's concept of the universal man into pattern making, and the result was the Lüderloh system, a masterpiece of German technology. The Lüderloh system enables the novice or expert home sewer to draft their own patterns, thus eliminating the tedious time and adjustments that were so common before. The Lüderloh system revolves off two body measurements, namely the bust and hip measurement. These two measurements will be concerned with the broadest portion of an individual above and below their waistline. To take these two measurements properly, you will need somebody to assist you. Now I'd like to introduce to you Dorothy Baker. Dorothy will be posing as my model, and then later she will be instructing you in the correct step-by-step sewing procedures. So Dorothy, in taking your bust measurement, you'll need some assistance. Dorothy, I'd like you to raise your arms like so. To take this measurement, simply put the tape measure across the bottom of the shoulder blades. Bring the tape tight up under the arm. Now, Dorothy, I'd like you to relax your arms down by your side. And then, if you would, turn towards the front. Then simply pull the tape across the fullest portion of the bust. Bring the tape taut and allow the tape to ease so there is simply you in there. Now, don't worry about the ease. The ease has been pre-calculated into each and every one of these patterns. And here we notice Dorothy measures 104 centimeters. Now, in taking your hip measurement, I suggest that you take three measurements. I suggest you measure your high hip, your wide hip, and then measure across your upper thighs. But remember, you'll only be using the largest measurement of these three measurements. Dorothy, I'd like you to put your feet all the way together and then raise your arms above your waist like so. The high hip measurement will vary 3 to 4 inches below the waistline. And here we note that Dorothy measures 96 centimeters. Then measure across your widest hip. That runs 7 to 9 inches below your waist. And here we note Dorothy has measured 97 centimeters. And then finally measure across your upper thighs. And Dorothy measures 94 centimeters. Thank you, Dorothy. Now, if you're like Dorothy and find that one of your measurements does end in an odd number, simply round that odd number up to the next highest even one. After taking the measurements, now you can refer your attention to the mathematical scale. On the scale, you will note there are two rows of numbers starting at 50 and ranging all the way up to 140 centimeters. And please note that the numbers jog back and forth in multiples of 2. Now these two rows of numbers represent your body measurements and body proportions. Simply find the measurement that you'll be using on the scale. In this case, that will be Dorothy's hip measurement of 98 centimeters. Then refer to the line under that 98 centimeters, follow that line all the way out to the right, and insert the tack in the hole that's been provided. Now, after completing the tack placement, your next step would be getting your pattern board ready. The pattern that I'll be using today will be pattern number 64, taken from the Lüderloh system. And note that sometimes the page must be folded over before it's attached to the center of your vellum paper. Also note inside of the pattern, you'll find a little cross or an X. Now if you don't see that little cross or X, placed inside the pattern, please note that you'll find it on the outside of the pattern with an X pointing to the little pattern piece that belongs to. Now simply take the tape and scale that has a tack inserted in it and insert the tack into the center of the cross on the pattern. As you will notice, the tape and scale revolves around the pattern freely. On every pattern you'll find that there are lines that project off the pattern, and on every line there's a specified number. Simply align the right side of the scale on that line. Whatever the number on that line is, in this case it is 15, come out to your tape measure to number 15 and mark a dot on your vellum paper. Move the scale to the next line. The next line has a number 19, so come out to your tape measure and mark number 19. The next one is 18, so come out to your tape measure to 18 and mark a dot. You'll continue this procedure, copying every line that surrounds the outside of the pattern until you have copied all lines. But be sure that in this process you don't overlook any one of these lines. Now whenever you see a line that sits off the pattern, in this case the 23.5, that dot is going to be placed on the inside of the pattern, or in this case the placket. Upon completing this procedure, now take the appropriate curve, in this case the Taylor's curve, and start connecting the outline of the pattern. This is done by simply looking at the pattern and copying whatever lines indicated on the outline of the pattern. Let me illustrate. Use the crotch curve portion of the Taylor's curve in connecting the outline dots of the crotch. If all the dots don't line up, simply continue the curve and connect the area of the pattern. Use the upper inseam portion of your Taylor's curve to connect the upper inseam dot of the pattern. And then finally, use the hip portion in connecting the hip outline of the pattern. Wherever a straight line is indicated, make it straight on the big pattern, and wherever it's curved on the little one, simply make it curved on the big one. When you determine the depth of the pleats, they should be anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 inches. In this case, I'm drawing in 2.5-inch pleats. Dorothy will expound on that later as we continue. Always be sure that you remember to mark the grain of the pattern. You'll notice on pattern number 64, the grain of the pattern is parallel to the vertical line of the cross of the pattern. And on the curve, there is a provided area to use to mark the straight of the pattern. Once this procedure is complete, remove the paper from the pattern, roll out more paper, enough to make the back panel on, and go over the same procedure, but this time making the back panel. After completing the outline of the back panel, you'll notice that the only difference between the front and back panel is that the back panel has a dart, whereas opposed to front panel had the two pleats. To draw the dart in, simply take the straight side of your Taylor's curve. From dot number 28, draw a straight line up to dot number 41.5, and do the same procedure on the other side. And always remember to mark the straight of the pattern using the appropriate cutout portion of your Taylor's curve. Now the final thing for us to do is make the pocket. We have enough paper here on the inseam portion of the back panel to use for making the pocket. Simply take the pattern off, attach it over to this side. Tape it back down in place. Take your tape measure with the scale, insert it in the cross that sits off the outside of the pocket pattern. And we'll just follow the same procedure as we have thus far in the making of the front and the back panel. Only this time we're going to be using the pocket. Now that we have completed this, we'll take the Taylor's curve again and start connecting the outline. Remember, wherever it's indicated straight, make it straight. And on the pocket, you'll notice there's a slight little curve right over here between dots 23 and 15.5. The rest of the pocket is simply consisted of straight lines. And to mark the grain of the pocket, we'll mark it, then again, parallel to the line that was made between dots 10 and 38. Now your next step would be cutting out your pattern pieces on the black lines so that we can adjust the patterns easier and more time effective. Now the next thing to do is check the waist of the pattern to be sure that the waist of the pattern is equivalent to your waistline. Simply measure the waist of your body and add 1 inch of ease for movement. Measure the width of the front panel with the pleats folded in, and measure the width of the back panel with the dart folded in. Add these two numbers together and that will give you the overall width of the waistline of the pattern. Now if the pattern does not meet your body requirements, make the adjustments on the back panel at the center back seam. If the adjustments that have to be made require adding more than 2 inches to the waistline, it is advisable that you use both side seams of the front and back panel as well as the center back seam. After adjusting the waistline of the pattern, the next step would be to check the overall length. Simply hold the panel up to your body and check to ensure that the length is appropriate for your body. If the pants pattern needs adjustment, make the adjustments at the pinhole on the pattern. To overlap the pattern, simply cut through the pattern and overlap it. To shorten it, cut through the pinhole and spread it to lengthen it. Now that you have completed adjusting the patterns, your next step would be cutting the fabric. Simply lay the patterns on the wrong side of the fabric and pin them in place to ensure that they do not shift on you. Now, in cutting your seam allowance, I will offer you two options. The first method that I'll offer you will be using the rotary cutter that has the adjustable guide arm on it. The other method would be taking tailor's chalk, tracing the outline of the pattern onto the wrong side of the fabric, and then taking scissors, go out away from the solid lines that you have marked and add your seam allowance. The reason I prefer using the rotary cutter is all you have to do is run the guide arm on the outside of the pattern, and as you notice, the cutter will be cutting out your seam allowance. I prefer this method over the use of conventional scissors because of the fact it saves time and it's by far more accurate. Now at the bottom, allow yourself at least enough material for 1.5 inches to a 2-inch hem. In this particular instance, I'll be using 1.5 inch hem. After having cut out the front panel, now proceed to the back panel. Follow the same technique as I've just illustrated, only this time cutting the back panel. And now, after you have completed cutting out all your pattern pieces, simply unpin the paper pattern from your fabric. So now, I would like you to focus your attention on Dorothy as she talks you through the step-by-step sewing procedures to follow.
On this pattern selection that Dan has just cut out, we have tucks in the front. As Dan has mentioned before, the tucks or darts are formed in your pattern. Now on these tucks, we're going to bring our straight lines that we have marked together, right sides together, and stitch. Reverse your stitching to start. Make sure that you can hold the seams. And as you end up at the end, slightly pivot out toward the edge of the fold, giving you a little bit more fullness on that particular end of the tuck. Now, if you would happen to have a larger waist and you had to do more alterations, you could also make an alteration in these tucks and not make them quite as deep. So we have 2 tucks on both sides, so let's finish our tucks. And again, we will sew down to the end and lock our stitches. All right, the tucks have been formed. Now the tucks will be pressed to the side seam. Next, we're going to place our pocket bags to our side front. As you can see, the front of the slacks has an angle going to the side seam. Now, with this angle, you can also see that there's a stretch in this fabric. So if we just seamed our seam across here and did not put any stabilizing agent there to keep it from stretching, and use of putting your hands in and out, of course, your pocket would be distorted. So I always like to put a facing on the pocket if it is not always given into your pattern. So you could cut just a strip of fabric the same as the length as the pocket that you have cut out and place it on the inside of your pocket bag. Now I have the wrong side of the facing down on the right side of the pocket bag, and just attach it to that bag by a zigzag stitch. That holds it in place on the pocket. All right, now our facing has been sewn to our pocket bag. We're going to place this facing and pocket bag right side to the pocket opening of our slack front. Now this is merely a piece of seam tape, and I'm placing the seam tape in the center of the seam that I'm going to stitch with the facing and pocket bag and front. Use your given seam allowance that you've allowed on your pattern. And of course, always put your markings, pin, and make sure every one of your cut edges are together. All right, trim your seam. Now you would be trimming back to a 1/4 inch seam, and you would be pressing this seam open. All right, now we have pressed our seam open to prevent the ditch in our mid seam. The pocket lining and facing is turned to the wrong side, and slightly fold your fabric back so that you will not see the seam at all, and then top stitch from the top side. You don't want the seam to roll over to the right side. Now using just a pressure foot width, or you may, if you would prefer, stitch in on the very edge and lengthen your stitch slightly so that you'll have a top stitch look rather than a shorter stitch. About a 3 to 3.5 stitch length is adequate. And I'm stitching just on the very edge, giving it more of an edge stitch look. This also sort of softens the look of the pocket. It gives you a more crisp look around the pocket area. Right, next we have our side pocket insert, which is part of our pattern piece that we have previously cut. Now, the construction goes from the wrong side. This pocket insert fits on the side of the pocket. The next procedure is to place the pocket insert in its position on the pant. Now we have a little snip at the top of the pant here, and we know that the insert is going to fit in this area. Place that insert on your pocket bag. Put it in place, and then again zigzag stitch down the cut edge inside the pocket bag so that will not fray. The pocket bag can be made out of any materials. I just have a piece of polyester that's a very compatible weight to my wool that I'm making in my slacks. All right, now the pocket insert has been stitched. We'll place our pocket over to the marks that you have a slit on the side, mark to the side. Now, you might not always have a smooth surface in this area for the simple reason that once you have tucked in your facing, you don't always get a real smooth surface. Don't worry about it. When you get your side seam sewn, it'll come up and take care of that surface. pin it in place, and now we are ready to proceed with the center front and do our zipper. All right, in construction of our zipper, we will place both front sections together. Right sides together. And we will stitch first from the crotch seam allowance up to the mark that we have marked just above our curve of our facing extension on our front of our pants. So using your seam allowance to start. Now when you're stitching this seam, it's very advisable to use either one of your utility stitches that may be a stretch seam, triple straight seam, whichever your machine has, or a very short straight seam, because this is a stress area on your slacks, and it is also very hard to get back into this area and to reseam. So make sure that you do have that area sewn in securely. Now you have the remainder of the front seam, center seam. Line it up with the markings that you have previously drawn so that you will be assured that you're going to be stitching exactly on the center seam. I'll line that up. Now lengthen your stitch length, and this is only going to serve as a basting seam. Don't sew over pins. Now we must press the center front open. This is going to give us a guide for the rest of our zipper application. Right now we have our center front basted together and pressed. I'm going to discuss a little bit about the purchase of zippers and the reason that you will need a longer zipper than your opening. If you have a 7-inch opening on a zipper on your garment, always make sure that you purchase a zipper that extends up past the top edge of your skirt or slacks so that you will not have to stitch around the slider of your zipper. Now this one is a 9-inch zipper this is going to be placed here at the bottom, and this is going to be the end at the top. So I've actually placed 2 marked lines showing that that's the top of my zipper. Now this is called basting tape. There are several different companies that put the product out. I prefer the one that has the 1/8 inch width. It's easier to put in with zippers. You don't have such a wide width of tape to stitch with. Lay your tape from the stop of your zipper to your marked line. You do not want to extend your zipper tape up past the top cut edge of your slacks. This tape has a protective shield, and once we put the tape on, we will actually be peeling that protective paper off, and then it will adhere to our fabric and become a basting device for us. It's used an awful lot in your zippers particularly. Now, the fly of a lady's slacks would work with the right lapping over the left. So let's keep that in mind, that we have a right that laps. That's going to be an overlap. We're going to have a left that goes under the overlap. So the left side is the underlap, the right side is the lap. That terminology is all we must remember, because otherwise we get all fouled up in our words. We're going to lay our zipper tape directly down on the facing side of the underlap side of our slacks. Now take your tape, the protective peel of your tape that is closest to the edge of the facing, the cut edge of the facing, and peel that protective edge off. Then your zipper naturally will just lay down there without having to do any pre-pinning. So there's your protective peel. Now line the inside of that zipper tape exactly with that front folded pressed seam. Now we're going to baste it down by just pressing it like this. So now we have it basted. Now we will stitch. The zipper is facing face down on the wrong side of the slacks. The right of the zipper is on the other side. Now let's stitch the zipper from the top down to the stop on the facing edge, the closest edge to the facing side. Now let's use a zipper foot so that we can get closer to our zipper teeth. And all of our machines have a zipper foot. This one has a zipper foot that we change needle position, so it's necessary to change your needle position and make sure that you also don't have it on a zigzag stitch, because we can break a needle. Now you also will note that I'm stitching from the top down. On the installation of zippers, I highly recommend that you always stitch in a directional stitching. So if you stitch from the top down on this side, make sure on the other side that you have also stitched from the top down. All right. Now this is the tricky one. We're going to take the protective peel of our zipper basting tape off. Now we're going to place the zipper, we're going to just take it and pull it all the way over. And when we do this, we're placing, it doesn't, there we go. It's stuck on my finger. Now as you do this, push with your fingers on this side to make sure that this is perfectly flat, because we're actually doing a basting with this tape. Press down, and now we have placed our zipper tape over on the overlap side. And the overlap side is where we'll stitch next. So again, we're going to stitch from the top down to the stop of the zipper with our zipper foot. Now you see there is ravelly edges, so those can be all taken care of with your overcasting stitch of your machine, or gently with a zigzag would work fine too. Now again, we're stitching close to the teeth. Our zipper is still face down. And I'm stitching from the same direction that I stitched previously. A very important thing when you're putting a zipper in is to keep the zipper above on your extension in the bottom. Make sure that the stop is above, so that when you sew across on the final stitching that you don't break a needle. All right, now we have our zipper installed on both sides, and we still have our basting in the front. So the last thing that we're going to do is actually top stitch down the side around the curve to this area. It's if you do not have prior lines down the front where you could actually stitch from the wrong side through to the front side, make a template out of that particular stitching line on your pattern and lay that template down on the overlap side of your slacks and actually put the markings so that you can have an outline stitching. And in doing that, use a water-soluble pen. And always when you use water-soluble pens, remember you don't press over the pen before you take water and get the lines out. That sets in that mark and it doesn't come out easily. So just put your dots down, and as you can see here, you actually have an outline to do your final top stitching. We've stitched from the top down on both sides, so we're also going to stitch from the top down. And this time I'm going to change and put my regular pressure foot back on because I have already stitched close to my zipper on both sides and I do not need it. And return my needle back to the center position. All right, now you can use a little longer stitch length here than you have used before because it is an outline stitching. And everything should be nice and smooth in this area. And as you notice, I'm stitching just inside of that stitching line rather than stitching on it. And I am right here, I feel my zipper stop. So I will put a pin so that I will be sure when I come down I will not stitch across the zipper stop and break a needle. Good trick for most of us. Now outline stitch around and over to the very edge. Now leave your needle in. This is usually really a wearing point at the bottom of the zipper. So change your needle position width and to a 1.5 width. This is for a little short bar tack. And change your stitch length to a very short stitch length, like a satin stitching. And then on an angle, just stitch across that corner of your fly, and then that'll keep it intact. On most of your purchased ones, you always see that you do have a little anchoring bar tack there. All right, now we can take out our basting stitches. And we should have our zipper in. Most of your purchased slacks that have a fly zipper in the front do have a zipper shield underneath it. This is only optional, and if you care to make one, it's very easy to take the same pattern that I just used to outline the zipper and make a front, a top portion, and also a facing for that particular zipper shield. If you're unsure which side is going to be on top, always make both of them out of the same fabric and you won't have any problem. I'm going to demonstrate that gently here so that you can see. And we'll get the rest of our basting stitches out. Be careful not to slice your fabric or your fingers because your scissors are very sharp also. Now I know all of you are going to expect a zipper opening here, and there you do have one. There's no puckers, no pleats, and there's our zipper opening. Now I'll keep this here in front while I'm placing the zipper shield. And remember, we used our little template for the outline here. We could take the same template and lay it down on a piece of the fabric and just give yourself seam allowances and do both of them out of the same fabric, or you could make one out of your fashion fabric and one out of your pocket lining. Stitch only on the curved area. I'm placing right sides together. With a straight stitch. Get to your curve, make sure that you slow your machine down and let your curve go very gently around so it'll be nice and smooth. Notch out the curved area so you can turn it. Okay, and then we can top stitch this edge also so that it can lay down. And you notice I only had a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. That's so that it will not have any bulk within that seam, and then just stitch down after you had pressed it properly, right down the very edge. Now the finished right side can be finished very easily by just overcasting that stitch with any of your overcast stitches, or those of you who are fortunate enough to have sergers. This is a special nice place to use for a serger. For the sake of time, we're just using zigzag stitches for all overcasting on our tape. Alrighty, next we are ready to install, you can cut now, our fly. This actually lays behind the underlap side of your zipper and can be sewn through all thicknesses here. So let me Now the zipper shield merely lays behind the zipper itself so that when you open it up, you have a protection of your skin and clothes from below. So just lay it down and stitch through on the underlap side. I'm lining it up, pin it in place. And again, a zipper foot would be the best tool to use here because we need to get close to that zipper seam allowance again. Then after we have this stitch in, we are ready to do our back of our pants. All right, now the back pants has 2 darts, one on each side. And we have marked the darts. If you would have had a larger waist measurement and needed to reduce a little bit at the darts, it could have been done, some of it, at this point. Place your marked lines together and stitch from the top, which is the fullest part of the dart, down to the very point of the dart. Stitch in your regular marking line. When you get about a 1/2 inch from the end of the dart, shorten your stitch length, and the last 1/2 inch stitch with that short stitch length and gently stitch off for about an inch. That's chaining your stitches off. Raise your pressure foot and go back within the seam allowance and press seam back and forth. Now you have eliminated the possibility of the bottom of the dart pulling out. Also, you have made the dart much smoother for you. The dart is pressed toward the center of the garment. Darts are pressed to the center, tucks are pressed to the side. All right, the next point of construction is joining your inseam pieces, your front and your back. Now stitch with the back of your garment down next to the feed, because the feed of your machine does the easing for you. So line it up, pin your garment in place so that you will have all of your cut edges together. And then when you get just above the knee area, in this area of your slacks, be sure that you stress the fabric as you sew, because this also has some stretch in that area because it was cut on an angle. This fabric has a lot of fraying. This is a good time to use your overcasting stitches on your machine or your serger. Now we've reached the area here that we want to stretch, so pull the top of the seam, and actually on this area, stretch as you sew. I've got a little clip to remind me. The next point of construction, we will stitch the side seams. All right, the out seam is also sewn with the back of the garment next to the feed. And you will be easing the back into the front. So pin your garment so that you'll know just exactly where your ease needs to be, and stitch. Your machine does the easing for you because the feed pushes the fabric on ahead. Well, they can cut them. Top and your side seams. This is where you want to be sure you smooth up going over the pocket at the side. You'll notice it all ends up just exactly where it needs to be. All right, your crotch seam is one seam that you have absolutely no ease. So you want to make sure that you keep all of your fabric together. And one assistance in your sewing is a walking foot at this particular seam. Cross all of your inseam stitching lines at this time, starting sewing back up in the front crotch. And then stitch along over all of those, and entirely stitch your crotch seam up to within 1 to 1.5 inches from the top of the pants. We'll leave that for the room to put on our waistband. You notice that the fabric just stays right together. Walking foot works super when you're working with plaids also. There you go, the top meets the top. And let's stop about a couple of inches from the top. Now we're ready to apply our waistband. All right, your waistband is actually cut the measurement of your waist plus your extensions on each end and your mid seam or your center back seam allowances. So you'll always have the waist measurement from center front to center back. Now, when you are applying your waistband, you need a good interfacing in the waistband. I have used a waist shaper. I like it because it's a double-sided. It has a perforated edge to give you a center fold. Be sure that you have marked your center front and your back seam line on your particular waistband so you'll know where you're going to ease in and ease the difference within your waist of your pants. The shorter side of your interfacing is the seaming line to your pants. The longer side is actually the facing side that goes back into your pants. So with right sides together, pin your interfacing to your waistband and your waistband, of course. Your darts naturally are going to remain pressed toward the center, and you can see how much ease is actually allowed. The side seam has been pressed to the back. Keep it that way. And always leave enough extension in the front so if you change your mind and want a different style that you'll have it. I prefer myself having a waistband that has a center back seam. I call it the in-case seam, just in case I eat more this month than I did last. All right, the waistband has been placed on the seam line of the trousers, and now we're going to seam the waistband on. You stitch with the pants next to the feed and your waistband on top. Being very careful that you do not get any pleats underneath. You should always keep your hands free on the left-hand side and press filling out. Make sure that you get the proper ease into your band. The little short edge on the facing side of your waistband can be turned under and zigzagged. Remember that your tucks press toward the side seam. We've mentioned that several times before, but we're going across those, so it'd be important that they stay. Then when we stitch across the zipper tape, make sure that you hand wheel. You can hear the little click when you come to those teeth, or you may possibly break a needle. Now the seam line would be trimmed and it would be pressed up toward your waistband like this. Then the remainder of your zipper tape at this time can be clipped off. And the other side is done the same way. Waistband up. And using the same seam allowance that you used before. And wheel it over your zipper tape there, making sure you don't hit any of those teeth. I think the most difficult part about putting in your waistband, of course, is when you're trying to get your overlap and your underlap smooth in front. And I will show you an easy way to do that. All right, again on this side, clip off your excess zipper tape. And then zip up your zipper in front and check out to make sure that your seam line goes over smoothly in both places. Now that should meet. If so, if not, you can also take a little deeper seam here to jimmy it up a little bit and make sure that it's correct. Now, on the waistband, if you will clip up to this stitching line and then fold your waistband with the right sides together, now you have a line to stitch out on your extension line. That seam allowance stays up in your waistband seam. Stitch out to the desired extension and stitch across. Of course, we will diagonally clip the corners to keep out the bulk and clip over to the side. And the very last thing that we do to the band after we have sewn the center back seam is to stitch in the ditch after we have turned this over and pressed our seams up. We must now pick up the center back seam because the center back seam has been left open just below the waistband. Your little tools, the point turners, come in very handy. A buttonhole can be made at your overlap, which is this portion. Put a button here and then put your snaps underneath to secure your pants. Now again, we'll go back to our center back and sew that seam up so that we can finish our stitching. Now we left a margin for a larger waistband at the center back. If we did, make sure that you stitch in that seam allowance so that you can have the waist adjustment that you needed. This was one place that we could make a waist adjustment. And now we're ready to turn and to stitch in the ditch after we have closed the front of the underlap. Again, clip up to our seam, turn right sides together, and at this time you may just stitch straight down so that that will be perfectly even. And of course trim it off. turn. Now the little extension underneath can be turned under on the interfacing and just zigzagged across. I'm going to do just a little section of it so that you can see how the finished work is, and then we're going to stitch in the ditch. I'll do it from the wrong side. I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Just place your machine back on your zigzag and over edge stitch so that you'll just be getting a fold on the end. And the way the waist shaper is manufactured, you actually have the longer side that goes down inside to make your facing. And finally, we're ready to finish our band by pressing our seam allowance up into our waistband. Now that could be trimmed. I have only sewn it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you may trim it. And then pin it down in place and machine stitch right down in the ditch of the seam that you have previously sewn. A lot of hassle about waistbands, but really we can get one in very quickly and very neatly. If you do not prefer as stiff a band, then you may just interface your waistband and therefore give you a softer feeling around the waist. Pin it in place. And then just stitch in that little stitching line that you had previously stitched, and that holds all of the band down. Now the next point of construction is to try the garment on and see what hem allowance that you have, and of course hem your trousers, and after you have hemmed them, of course give them a good firm press and you are ready to wear them. All we need is a fastener on the front, either a hook and eye or a button, either one that you prefer. On the waistband, you need to always keep your pins at the fold and give yourself the benefit of help here. I didn't, and I can see that I needed to, because this seam goes back into the waist and you're stitching in the ditch. So you would avoid that pitfall there if I had not done that. Now smooth out. Now on the very front side, diagonally put your seam allowance in and turn this section of your facing down so that you would have a smooth line right under the overlap side of your waistband. Nice smooth extension. All seams are pressed, and your waistband's in, and also your hemline is ready, and we'll be ready for try-on. I'll turn you over now to Dan.
And now, as you have just seen, you too can start sewing a wardrobe of perfectly fitting garments without that expensive cost. For more information, contact Daniel Fink in care of Universal Sewing Supplies, 8012 Kansas Road Southeast, route number 39 in Fort Myers, Florida. Zip code 33912.